All right, let's get into it. We're talking about the First World War, a conflict so massive, so all-consuming, that it literally redrew the map of the world and completely changed the course of the 20th century.
Long before the first shots were ever fired, you could feel the drumbeat of war all across Europe. And this wasn't just happening in the halls of government. The obsession with military power was everywhere. It had seeped right into the playroom. Kids had models of the latest battleships and could probably tell you all their stats. It's a pretty clear sign of a continent that was absolutely gearing up for a massive arms race.
So how did it even get to this point? Well, our story really begins on a continent that was just simmering with tension. It was tangled up in these complex alliances and driven by some seriously powerful ambitions. You could say Europe was like a giant tinderbox, just waiting for a spark.
And right at the heart of all this tension was Germany, led by the very ambitious Kaiser Wilhelm II. See, he was determined to turn Germany from just a European power into a world power. This really aggressive foreign policy, well, it made his neighbors nervous. It ended up splitting the continent into two heavily armed camps. You had the Triple Alliance, that's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, staring down the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain.
It's actually kind of incredible how a single piece of technology could pour so much fuel on the fire. When Britain launched HMS Dreadnought back in 1906, this one ship instantly made every other battleship on the planet obsolete. So what did Germany do? They frantically rushed to build their own dreadnoughts, and that kicked off an incredibly expensive and tense naval arms race that just sent the rivalry with Britain through the roof.
So you've got this incredibly tense standoff. It just couldn't last forever, right? The single event that finally lit the fuse on this whole European powder keg happened on one fateful day in a city most people at the time had probably never even heard of.
So it's June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who's the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting Sarajevo. An assassin tries to get him with a bomb, but it just bounces off his car and hits the car behind him. So later that day, after visiting the wounded officers in the hospital, the Archduke's driver takes a wrong turn and stalls the car. And who is he stalled directly in front of? Another assassin, Gavrilo Princip, who just steps forward and fires the fatal shots. Just unbelievable luck or unluck, depending on how you see it.
So here's the crucial part. His one assassination didn't just stay a local crisis. Because of that tangled web of alliances we were just talking about, it dragged the entire continent and eventually the world into war.
And this slide just perfectly illustrates the chain reaction. It's like watching dominoes fall in real time. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilizes its army. So Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia. Then on Russia's ally, France. And when Germany invades neutral Belgium to get to France, Britain declares war on Germany. All of that happened in just 1 week. The world went to war.
You have to understand, in that summer of 1914, a wave of what they called patriotic fervor just swept across Europe. Millions of young men enthusiastically signed up, completely convinced it was going to be a short, glorious adventure. You can even see it here. German soldiers optimistically scribbled "day trip to Paris" on their train cars. They honestly believed they would be home by Christmas.
But that early optimism, it was shattered, quickly and brutally. This war wasn't going to be short, and it certainly wasn't going to be glorious. It descended into the horrific reality of industrialized warfare on a scale that humanity had just never, ever seen before.
This quote from a French soldier really just captures the sheer terror of it all. At a battle like Verdun, the artillery bombardment was so constant, it turned the entire landscape into this desolate, muddy inferno. The ground was just a churned-up mess of shell craters and, horribly, the bodies of fallen comrades. It was a true vision of hell on Earth. And that's because this was the world's first truly industrial war. You had factories, just like this one in Germany, operating around the clock, just churning out millions of artillery shells, machine guns, and bullets. The incredible scale of industrial production translated directly into an incredible scale of slaughter.
Technology had completely outpaced tactics. All these terrifying new weapons were unleashed for the very first time. Choking poison gas that would drift across no man's land. Stealthy submarines called U-boats that could sink ships without any warning. Fighter planes dueling in the skies, and the first, clumsy but absolutely fearsome tanks rumbling across the battlefield.
But, innovation wasn't just for killing. To counter that U-boat threat, the Allies actually turned to artists, and they came up with this: dazzle camouflage. The point wasn't to hide the ship. That's impossible. The point was to use these bold geometric patterns to make it incredibly difficult for a U-boat captain to judge the ship's speed and its direction. It just made it a much, much harder target to hit with a torpedo. Pretty clever, right?
And amid these millions of soldiers, you find these incredible stories of individual courage. People like Elsie Knocker, an English nurse who, with her friend Mary Chisholm, set up a first aid post right on the front lines in Belgium, saving countless lives. Or boy sailor Jack Cornwall. He was only 16 years old. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Jutland, but he stayed at his post until the very end.
So for years, the war was just this brutal, grinding stalemate of trench warfare. So how was that stalemate finally broken? And maybe more importantly, what was the price the world paid for peace?
Okay, so two huge events completely changed the final years of the war. First, America enters the fight in 1917, partly because of Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. Then, in early 1918, Russia, which was being torn apart by revolution, leaves the war. Now that freed up German troops, for sure, but the arrival of fresh American soldiers and all their resources, that's what ultimately tipped the balance in favor of the Allies.
After Germany's final desperate offensive failed, its army basically collapsed. An armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. But the formal end came with the Treaty of Versailles, signed right here in the Hall of Mirrors. It imposed really harsh penalties on Germany, forcing it to accept all the blame for the war, pay crippling reparations, and give up territory. It completely redrew the map of Europe. But that peace, it came at a price that is almost unimaginable. The human cost was just catastrophic. Let's start with the military dead alone. Over 8 million soldiers were killed in combat.
And beyond the dead, more than 21 million men were wounded. An entire generation was left permanently disabled, disfigured, or suffering from the deep psychological trauma of constant bombardment, an injury they started calling shell shock.
And the devastation reached far, far beyond the battlefield. The war on the home front, through famine, disease, and direct military attacks, claimed the lives of over 6.6 million civilians. When you add all that up, an entire generation was just lost. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. We know now it wasn't. But its legacy is one of immense sacrifice and unimaginable loss. And that really leaves us with a final thought. After a conflict that cost so much and so profoundly changed our world, how do we, and how should we, choose to remember?